As promised, this is the recording for the Climbing Everest student engagement for Generation Z students for the Teaching and Learning Conference 2020, Winchester University. So the idea behind the analogy of Everest is to try and replicate what the size of the challenge is that we face in higher education and within a learning context attached to student engagement, because this is a huge concept. So hopefully this presentation will go some way to provide those some takeaway strategies to underpin by theory that's going to support experience and evidence to challenge the modern student engagement of Generation Z students and Generation Alpha students. Also explore the modern notion of student engagement for the modern student, and then consider how we get students to buy in to what we want them to do. So what is student engagement? Well, student engagement refers to the degree of curiosity, attention, interest, optimism, passion that the students demonstrate when they're learning or being taught, and that extends to the level of motivation that they are experiencing to help them learn and progress within their education. So Kahoo 2013 suggests that the concept has lost all meaning now. So student engagement is now become this broad brush term that no longer holds its original meaning. And it's become a proxy for quality within education, which is a negative concept, really, because we see now that student engagement is merely became an umbrella term for a multitude of different things, as opposed to the concept and the original meaning of engagement, which means to contribute to something or to interact in something. So we can look at then to kick off with the levels of student engagement and the work by Bob Scialetti. I'm not sure what the question might. Bob Scialetti is a lecturer and professor in the US, University of North Carolina, and he was involved in a multitude of different things. Probably his most recent work was his work that he did with the scale-up approach to learning and teaching, which was championed by Trent University in their Scale Up project around, and Scale Up stands for student-centered approaches to upside down pedagogies. Student-centered approaches to learner engagement using upside down pedagogies. That's what it stands for. I got there in the end. And what Bob Scialetti suggests is that there are actually 5 levels of engagement. And students are only ever actually truly engaged when they demonstrate high levels of attention and high levels of commitment. Apart from that, there's 5 stages. So some students will be rebellious. If those students are rebellious, they'll look to divert attention away from the actual learning situation, maybe towards themselves, and then have no commitment to learning at all. This can often be in relation to wider issues other than what's going on in the classroom. You've got retreatism, where there's no attention being given to the content that's being delivered, and then there's no commitment from the students, so they're just totally distance themselves from anything that's going on. And then you get the first stage of learning, which is ritual compliance, so students demonstrating low attention, low commitment. And then you get strategic compliance, so high levels of attention being placed, low commitment, and then engagement, high attention, high commitment. We can link these sort of end 3 levels to some work done by other theorists, which we'll come on to in a sec. But we can class ritual compliance as surface level students. We can class strategic compliance as strategic students, and we can class engagement as deep level students. So there's deep level students, those students that hang about in the classroom afterwards. They're always asking the questions. They're always looking for that wider understanding, but fundamentally they teach themselves. You just provide the spark. They're motivated, they're emotive in that content, and they look to develop their understanding at every opportunity. So your surface level students would do just enough to get by. Your deep level students, obviously they're the committed ones, but your strategic students are very assessment focused. They literally ask you what is being covered and is this in the assessment. They're not shy in coming forward with that information. And again, that links to some work by Martin and Salio, and then also coincide with Biggs around strategic learning. So linking content into assessment requirements, close attention to the marking criteria, as opposed to surface students that just offer that routine memorization that just literally just scratch the surface of the tasks that need to be done. They never really push themselves forward for anything higher from a grade perspective. But then there can be reasons behind this, is that we get obviously a multitude of different students addressing and attempting a multitude of different subjects. So students are not always on university courses because it's their choice. There's a whole manner of different pressures and constrictions that are placed on students that steer them to particular disciplines that they may not be interested in. For example, there might be some cultural persuasions towards medicine or medical practices, when really students want to focus more towards information technology, computing, design, those sorts of things. But what we need to remember is that we need to remember about the fact that we're delivering to Generation Z students now. So Generation Z students obviously are students that are classed as the first true digital natives. They're defined as conscientious, hardworking, mindful of the future. They're looking to give back. They're always tracing that dream job, and they're looking at growth. But going back to the dream job, is they're almost immersed in something of a narcissistic culture because of what they are exposed to from the degrees of social media. This idea of perfection and chasing perfection. They want the perfect life, the perfect career, the perfect house, because of the things they're immersed in around social media. So this has a big impact on steering them in their careers and in their futures. But also, it's very much the on-demand culture. So everything's at the touch of a finger. They don't wait for anything. It's smart phones driven. It's smart life. Okay. So then, aside from that, if we go back to the concept of what student engagement is, we can look at work by Friedrichs, Blumenfeld, and Paris around the 3 dimensions of engagement, which are behavioural, emotional, and cognitive. With cognitive engagement being around how students invest in their learning, so the amount of effort that they put in, and self-regulation, so the amount of discipline that they attach to their learning. The emotional engagement around the emotional reactions in the classroom and in the school, and that sense of belonging and connectedness to the school, almost as sort of a cohesive understanding to their colleagues within their disciplines. And then behavioural engagement, which looks at the participation and the level of academic, social, and extracurricular activities that they undertake within school. And this can often be driven by various different factors. So, like as we were speaking about earlier, internal, external pressures. The personality plays a big impact as well on how it's driven. Then we've got work by Advanced HE, formerly the Higher Education Academy, in 2015, on engagement as a human state. So looking at engagement as a human action, but linking into those ideas around intellectual, so the cognitive, emotional, and behavioural engagements, but looking at behavioural as reasoning for attending and reasoning for engaging in sessions. But then they also bring in things like physical, social, and cultural engagement. There's a big dialogue at the moment around can it be measured? So engagement isn't the same thing as learning, and we've seen what happened when we tried to measure learning gain. So learning gain was the idea developed by Hefke around measuring the distance travelled by students, looking at what they entered their course with academically and then what they left their course with academically, and trying to measure the distance between the two. And the real sort of issue with that is that it failed to take into account the sort of the hidden curriculum, the interpersonality growth, and those things like the wider employment skills and those sorts of things that needed to be measured. You've got the UK engagement survey that Alex Buckley develops at the University of Strathclyde and around looking at collecting data on engagement, which pretty much works on a similar sort of thing. So it works on the basis of looking at entrance and exit and looking at the experience of students within that particular time period. But again, engagement isn't learning. Okay, engagement is its energy, its connection within a learning setting. It's not the consumption of new knowledge. The challenges that students face then, they face things like students can be over comfortable, they may have access to issues towards online learning, they may have access issues to university, to campus. Students might start to feel like they're overworked or overloaded due to limitations in understanding around how people find their private lives. There's obviously the students will paint a picture that they've got everything under control and they often hide certain issues, but then it's only when you start to turn the screw and apply the pressure of academic studies that then you start to find out the true skills of the student within that. So obviously we're in sort of a post-lockdown era, or starting to come out of a lockdown era. So there's going to be elements of things like isolation, anxiety attached to that, anxiety about going back into life, back outside and being in social circles and being about in society can provide anxiety for people. And then there is anxiety attached to learning and being in physical spaces or being in online spaces that some students may struggle with. There's those elements of previous personal educational experiences. So the ideas of Eastern versus Western cultures attached towards learning and teaching. And when we've got international students come in, they're expected to contribute, they're expected to be open, be expected to answer questions. And that very much goes against the very essence of their educational upbringing, of challenging the lecturer, challenging the educator, where the educator is seen as the utmost authority within that discipline. You can have challenges around things like transition, so students moving away from home for the first time, moving into campus, and then being away from friends and family and formulating new relationships and working arrangements. And then you've got assumptions, so assumptions around the skills and the attributes that students are coming in with, and assumptions around what knowledge students hold. So obviously there's online pressures for staff, there's also online pressures for students, so staff shouldn't feel pressured to offer anything else other than what they would normally offer when delivering lectures online. So you should still be as interactive with the students, and then you should still be talking about using pre-sessional tasks. But most importantly, you should make sure you break your sessions down into content-specific bite-sized chunks, because we need to bear in mind what students can absorb and upload to their sort of deep memory. Now, because it's online, obviously sessions can be paused and things can be easily digested. So we have that option. But even in things like longer lectures, give the students opportunities to digest content, have things like think time in there, pose a question, but give the students time to think, encourage pauses in practice, use images as well that offer different ways and multiple means of representation within a particular session. So at De Montfort University, we offer or we utilise a process called Universal Design for Learning. And Universal Design for Learning is something that was undertaken by cast.org, and I'll post a link to that on the Padlet page. But Universal Design for Learning is our framework for our inclusive teaching and learning practices. And what it works on is it works on three core areas. So it works on multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, and multiple means of action and expression. And what this then results in it drives our need as educators to develop that interest, to develop that need for effort and persistence, and also self-regulation within practice. And it also develops things like perceptions, comprehensions, cohesion, physical action, and functionality within that learning and teaching environment. So anybody that's interested in learning more about the University Design for Learning approach, visit cas.org and have a look at that, because there is a really good piece of work by Rose and Mayer around their core framework, and it is all sort of contextually linked to cognitive development. So it is really interesting. But what it does champion is this notion of differentiation and inclusion in the classroom, and it looks at allowing people not only the chance to offer examples and answers to assessments via written means, but also through physical means, through images, through literature, through a multiple diverse approach to learning and teaching. So how do we genuinely engage students then? And what we're referring to how they learn and what motivates them. And this is important because connections matter. What we've got to do is we've got to start to get to know our students more. All right. Now, I appreciate if this is in a setting where you deliver one-off sessions, it's going to be really difficult. But what you can start to do within that context is you can start to build a picture post-session of the students that access your provision, and we'll talk more about what you can do in a sec. So we need to start seeing engagement as an umbrella term. So engagement is an umbrella term for things like interest, motivation, inclusion, rapport, interaction, attention, involvement, participation, contribution as a starter. All right, but it is an umbrella term. And what we need to do is, instead of just referring to situations and scenarios as engagement, we need to break it down and look at it in its specific finite elements, because that way, then we'll be able to link in and look at how we genuinely develop our practice. So there's a Padlet page if you want to just pause the presentation and contribute to. Looking at how would you like to be engaged from a learning setting, and how do your thoughts on how you like to be engaged differ from your learners? And then you can share that on the Padlet link. So it's GHughes58 at Everest. And pause the presentation and by all means have a go at that. So welcome back if you pause the presentation. So I teach on our postgraduate certificate in academic practice, and one of the things we're starting to get the staff to do now is to really sort of use a reflective lens on engagement and look at how they interact with students, and looking at their practice and breaking down what do we perceive as being the ideal level of student engagement within our teaching practice. What would we like to see? Is there an ideal balance between interest, motivation, inclusion, rapport, active learning, providing clear focus for the students and differentiation? Or when we change that, what does our practice actually look like? Do we spend a whole heap of time trying to develop interest when actually we should be developing motivation? Or do we look at spending time building rapport? Actually, we should be looking at developing active learning approaches to foster interest. It's a really difficult process. So what you need to do now is you need to think about, well, moving forward, how am I going to change my practice? And undertake this task. Give yourself a bit of a pie chart and try and break down, well, what does the ideal session look like from a student engagement perspective? And then what do I genuinely attempt to do that's going to look to build on that practice? So we can start to come back to the Everest analogy now. So we start to look at, okay, how are we going to get to that summit? Well, what we need to do is we need to think about the process and the journey. We're not going to be able to climb the mountain for ourselves. We're going to need support. We're going to need feedback. We're going to need support from our colleagues. We're going to need our wider network of academic support across the faculties. And then what we need to do is we need to look at establishing a baseline, all right, foundations. Everything builds off foundations. So we need to look at a baseline, and we need to work up our levels until we get to the summit. And when we get to the summit, that is when we're going to get engagement. So here we go. We're starting at the baseline level. We're at sea level here. So most important phase is priming the students, and I want you to have a consistent question in the back of your mind when you're developing your teaching practice. And I want you to ask yourself, how do I activate engagement? And so by answering that question, what you're going to start to develop is you're going to start to develop a picture of your commitment levels to engagement. What opportunities do you provide students to perform? So from a baseline perspective, we need to make sure that we've got things like pre-sessional activities for students to interact with. We've got some pre-sessional research. Maybe we've got some elements in there, a bit of profiling from the students that we've had chance to. But fundamentally, we're going to use this time to build rapport with students. So previously, at the teaching conference, there was a presentation by colleagues at Derby University, and they were talking about spending the first 4 weeks to get to know their students. Not everyone's going to have that privilege. So think about, well, do I build it up at the start or do I build it up at the end of my sessions? But somewhere along the line, you need to start gathering some feedback from students around your sessions. So once you've got your baseline practices in place, then you can start to build and start to go on your journey, and you can start to progress up to the summit. Think about for low level engagement tasks, such as things like gamification activities, Kahoot, Socrative, Padlet, those sorts of things. And make sure that people know that these are secure spaces. These are anonymized spaces for people to contribute. Once people know they've got that anonymized space to contribute, then they're going to start to open up. They're going to start to build. They're going to start to apply themselves more to the practices that you require. At medium level, you've got things like rewarding contributions. And so to go from that low level to medium level, you've got to think about building efficacy. You've got to think about building confidence for your students. Once you start to do that, then you're going to start to be able to build on receiving feedback from the students and get them to support and discuss open dialogue. From there on, we go to the high level, and then when we get to base camp at medium level, that's often enough for some people. That's often enough. I mean, that's a success story in itself, really, to get to there. But what you want to think about is moving forward. All right, I'm taking my practice onwards and forwards. How am I going to do that? How am I going to develop that further? Well, what you can do is, when moving from the base camp into the death zone, is that we need to be wary of what can happen if it goes wrong. We need to think about, we don't want it to go back. All the good work, we don't want it to unravel. Anybody that's taught will know that if you've got students with very low self-esteem, to build that esteem takes time, all right? And it can take weeks and it can take months to build self-esteem, to get students to truly believe in themselves. But it can be something so fragile that the slightest little thing can unravel it. So what we need to do is formulate practices and processes to get people to contribute, get people to provide feedback, to allow things to build praise in. Maybe you want to start allowing students to lead feedback, pose questions, engage in activities such as reflective practice, allow them to formulate into breakout groups, and then nominate someone to feedback. You'll start to people to build responsibility. And then from that point on, you should be able to move into getting that deep level engagement. You can start to slowly let go of the reins and to allow people opportunity to become autonomous in their learning. And this is where activities that are more student-centered become along. Allow students to make mistakes, allow students to become critical and analyze practices, theories, and be genuinely creative, because at this stage students are going to feel like they can be creative once you make that point. But success doesn't come in straight lines, so we know that, and ascending Everest is going to take time. So think about breaking your session up. You've got to break your session up into manageable bite-sized chunks. Think about it as a 15-inch pizza. You're not going to eat a 15-inch pizza, but you're going to eat it slice by slice. So think about, right, okay, I'm going to break my session now. I'm going to go back to my plan. I'm going to look at my session. I'm going to use 2 minutes, 4 minutes, 8 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 25, 35, 40, 45, and so on. All right. And really plan your session, because what can happen is when you start to overload students with too much work and too much tasks, then they can start to switch off. All right, but to maintain focus and concentration, think about breaking that down into manageable chunks. And always maintain a focus of what the session purpose is. All right, so for this session, we're going to look at this element here because this is linked into the assessment, or this element is linked into industrial demands, or this is new in the industry, this is innovative in the industry. Always bring that relevance and that context back, and so people know that actually what I'm learning isn't something that's old and left over from 15 years ago. Actually, this is new, this is current, this is relevant, because that's something that can engage and disengage students as well. The relevancy and the currency of the module. If you're going to be working online, make sure that you stay connected and in contact with your students, and just be aware of external commitments and challenges that students may have. Things like school runs, things like being carers, things like access to reasonable Wi-Fi. Think about operating quality over quantity and depth over volume, because in that way then you get a deeper learning experience as opposed to bombarding students with a multitude of reading that they're never really going to do. Make sure all resources are available, and then establish what resources are at hand first and foremost. Make sure students have access to everything that they need from an online platform. And then when you deliver, have your camera on at all times, so that the students can see that actually there is someone there. It is a real person that's delivering this session. It's a human being. And make sure there's a clear structure and a clear purpose. As we mentioned before, keep going back to that purpose. If you want something to try and engage the students more from a questioning perspective, then by all means use a structured series of questioning, such as what's on the screen, and just differentiate more. But what you need to do is you need to give people a platform to respond. So use things like anonymized Padlets or Mentimeters, or the chat box option, because what that'll do is that will give people confidence that they can post an answer to a question, but then once you pick up on that answer and then you start to offer some praise, then it's going to start to come back. That praise is going to be reciprocated. That's going to build esteem. Then they're going to go in and they can apply again to something. So build it up and set it up. Remember, activate engagement, open platform for questioning, moves on to small group questioning, but only small groups of 4, never any more than 4, because if you have any more than 4 in a group, you get what's called social loafing. Students not performing as required because they start to become passengers. Then you can move on to paired questions, and then individual questions, from individual questions to tutor pre-planned questions from the students. So you take questions from the students. From building that up, you'll start to get students to contribute more and build that esteem. We know what we've got at hand because we've been using it for the last year. So we've got plenty of environmental extras, and there's a multitude of different things out there. What I would strongly recommend, if you're not using anything like this in a minute, but you're interested to, try and just familiarize yourself with probably a selection of 3 online strategies, because there's such a plethora of different things to use. It's a bit easy to become consumed with everything that's available. So just try and take a step back and think, actually, I just want to go back and use probably Kahoot, Socrative, Padlet, or Kahoot, Mentimeter, Padlet, of 3 really good, solid go-to resources that work really well on both mobile and online for the laptop. But finally, what we need to realise is that actually motivation is a really sort of crucial strand, and there is really clear links between self-efficacy and engagement. And Ashgard pointed that out in 2014, and she spent time researching the fact that actually motivation and engagement go hand in hand, because what you need to do is think about, am I providing those physiological needs for my students and those safety needs? If I don't feel safe in a learning environment, I'm probably not going to attend, or definitely not going to contribute and put myself out there for any more grief. So are you addressing those as a minimum benchmark? Once you've done that, we build the sense of belongingness. Once we've done the sense of belongingness and people have got intimate relationships, friendships, or a bit of a purpose, then we can start to progress. People will start to learn from that point on. But fundamentally, it's a team effort. So make sure you interact with your colleagues, not only in your institutions, but on a wider network, because you're not in it alone. This is a national challenge, and hopefully we're all We're all in it together. Thanks very much for listening.